Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I just started recording, so that is happening. Um, so I'm Lynn Carpenter. If you're not familiar with me, I'm the director of the center and very excited to have someone I've gotten to know very well with us today. I'm going to do my best here. Katie Takayanagi. I got I got it right. Pretty much. Sorry. So Katie from Alphabetic City Phonics is here with us today. Katie has been one of our Orton-Gillingham fellows who have been training Churchill teachers and is leading our practicum. And we were having this session today. Actually, I think I saw Jennifer Hamilton check in, and last spring, Jennifer was saying, we were also excited about starting OG training. She was like, you should think about a parent talk. I thought that was such a great idea because I feel like OG is so often recommended and talked about and all of that, but I thought it'd be great to kind of get into the why, and who better to explain it than the person who is teaching our Churchill faculty. So Katie is an accredited Orton Fellow. She's an Orton-Gillingham teacher, trainer, and tutor based in Brooklyn. She has 20 years of experience as an educator and 12 years as an OG practitioner. In addition to working as a teacher, trainer, and tutor, Katie leads a team of tutors at Alphabet City Tutors. She has extensive experience with middle and high schoolers, as well as all ages, who are beyond the typical age for OG tutoring. These students often need both foundational phonics instruction as well as help in more advanced areas such as reading comprehension, essay writing, vocabulary building, morphology, and study skills. So I'm going to turn it over to Katie, and you can feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go, but then we'll save them for the end. All right, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lynn. I always keep myself muted when I'm not talking because I live at a very busy intersection in Brooklyn. But thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be working with Churchill School and such a big group of teachers. My colleague and actually one of my mentors, Lori Cuso, who's also an accredited training fellow with the Orton-Gillingham Academy, she and I are working together to just sort of lead a big group of teachers in this sort of really ambitious kind of large scale project at Churchill to take, there are already things that are very OG based that have been going on in the school for years, but to really formally implement an Orton-Gillingham Academy training and the practicum and really sort of get in depth with the Orton-Gillingham approach. So yeah, so as someone who I've tutored for many years, I have a tutoring practice in addition to my teacher training practice. It was really neat to get to think about what would be some information that would be helpful to share with parents because, I mean, as Lynn said, OG is often recommended, but it's not something that parents usually really know about as they're seeking out this sort of instruction for their children. And even a lot of teachers, they've heard of it, but don't totally know what it is. So let me just show you. Our plan for today is I'm going to talk about just basically what is Orton-Gillingham, specifically through giving you a little quick history of who Orton and Gillingham were. I'm going to tell you about the principles of Orton-Gillingham instruction that really kind of guide and define what our teaching looks like. I will talk about what we do in an Orton-Gillingham lesson. And then also, why do people, why is Orton-Gillingham so widely recommended for dyslexia? What makes it effective for dyslexia? So I'll actually give you a little bit of information, sort of some neuroscience information about the brain, what we know about the reading brain, and also how the brain with dyslexia reads slightly differently. I'll also talk about what's different, or sort of what's the difference between the Orton-Gillingham approach versus, different reading programs out there. I'll tell you just sort of briefly about what the Orton-Gillingham teacher training entails, and then also some things about how Orton-Gillingham supports a variety of aspects of the reading process. And so I'm going to refer to it often as OG for short, since it's a little bit of a cumbersome name. Okay, so this is kind of a big block of text, but this is kind of the elevator pitch that I share with people to try to touch on all of the major points of just what Orton-Gillingham is and why we use it. So just to sort of summarize before we drill down on some of these things, Orton-Gillingham, it's research-based, it's multisensory, it's for teaching reading, but also just really all aspects of literacy. So writing, spelling, penmanship, even higher level literacy skills as you get into working with older students. Like Lynn talked about, I actually had done my OG training in a high school. So I had sort of a unique experience of doing a lot of OG with older students where you're really using sort of complex literacy skills. And so it was designed for individuals with dyslexia. It's named after Dr. Samuel Orton, who was a Harvard-trained neuropsychologist or neuropsychiatrist and pathologist, and Anna Gillingham, who is a psychologist and a master educator, and they worked together to develop Orton-Gillingham. So it's the basis of a lot of reading programs. So you might hear people say that they do a certain program that's OG based. So Wilson and then the Wilson Classroom reading program called Foundations. Those are based on OG and they were developed by an OG fellow, same sort of background and training to myself. PAF, Linda Mood Bell Lips. There are tons and tons of programs, depending on your experience with different reading programs, these might sound familiar, but actual Orton-Gillingham is not considered a program. It's considered an instructional approach. And the approach has certain guiding principles. Two of the major principles are that it's diagnostic and prescriptive. It's really meant to be personalized and tailored to the specific needs of the student. You can use it with any age. So adults, sometimes even older adults, can get Orton-Gillingham. It's really effective. It's not actually just for people who have a dyslexia diagnosis, but anyone who's having any amount of difficulty with reading or spelling or writing, can benefit from Orton-Gillingham. And actually, there's a lot of talk about the science of reading and making sure that the programs that are just in like all elementary classrooms for teaching reading, that they be based on the reading science. Many of those really effective, strong classroom programs are based on Orton-Gillingham. Okay, so I won't take too much time on the history, but just to give you some background, because I think it's important. Okay, the name Orton-Gillingham, it's kind of an unusual name, but so Dr. Samuel T. Orton, he's the Orton part of the name. He was a neurologist and a neuropsychiatrist, so he was studying the brain, but this was, his work was 100 years ago. So he didn't have the technology that we have now, but he actually early in his career, he was in Iowa. In 1925, he created a mobile mental hygiene clinic. So basically, he was sort of traveling through these rural areas in Iowa so he could serve patients who weren't always able to get to, to medical centers. And one of the patients that he met was a bright 16-year-old who couldn't learn how to read. And this was really baffling. I mean, especially 100 years ago, learning differences were really not understood. And so there were a lot of assumptions about what it must mean about your intelligence or your mental health, or did you have a brain injury or something if you couldn't learn how to read. So this was a very interesting case for Dr. Orton, and it actually changed his whole career. It really got him interested in this particular question, and really, it got him sort of impassioned about focusing on young people and a lot of times young adults who were not able to read, or they were having these sort of language processing difficulties, which was really mystifying at that time and misunderstood. So through his work, he identified what he called a specific language disability, which was sort of revolutionary to realize that this was a difficulty that was really just specifically having to do with language. Otherwise, these were very bright young people. And so he came up with this term, strephosymbolia. He didn't use the term dyslexia yet, but strephosymbolia meant twisted symbols. And that was sort of the like stereotype of dyslexia, that you mix up your letters or you maybe flip them around. He really believed that there was a favorable prognosis for these young people as long as they received the right instruction. And so he, with his wife, June Orton, who is another important part of the Orton name, she was a social worker. And so she came up with these multisensory teaching strategies. Dr. Orton really felt that a lot of different sensory inputs needed to be employed to teach these young people how to read who hadn't learned through their traditional classroom instruction. And Dr. Orton really kind of developed this set of principles that he thought were important and what these young people needed in order to learn how to read. So that's Dr. Orton and his wife, June Orton. The Gillingham part of Orton-Gillingham comes from Anna Gillingham. She was an educator, a psychologist, and an author with a superb mastery of language. She really deeply and intricately understood the English language. And she actually worked for decades at the Ethical Culture School, Fieldston in New York City. Dr. Orton also had a New York City connection where he was on faculty at Columbia University. So they did a lot of their work in New York. So in 1929, Anna Gillingham heard about what Dr. Orton was doing, and she was really interested in joining him. And so she got a research fellowship and was able to work with him. So one of her really huge contributions to Orton-Gillingham, the approach, is that she and her partner, Bessie Stillman, who was also a master teacher, first of all, they really kind of took the concept of multisensory teaching that Dr. Orton was thinking about and kind of crystallized it in terms of how to incorporate visual, auditory, and kinesthetic in terms of like movement. All of those sensory pathways, those are sort of the major pathways that we tap into, all throughout an OG lesson. But also really looking at the English language that's so complex and figuring out how to just break it down into these simple steps so that it can be taught in a way that goes from simple to complex. And so they really laid out all of the rules of English and made it so that it wasn't just this kind of crazy seeming overwhelming thing, but something that could really be taught piece by piece in a logical way over time. And they put all of that information into what's now called the Gillingham Manual, which is sort of like our textbook, our Bible of Orton-Gillingham. And also Anna Gillingham was the co-founder of the Orton Society, which is now the International Dyslexia Association, which is, a very important organization in the field of dyslexia. So from the beginning, Orton-Gillingham has been really sort of based in a science and medicine and education and psychology sort of merger. So, even now, like as an Orton-Gillingham Fellow, I am constantly attending professional development trainings and reading articles that are about, best practice in education, but also brain research and how we continue to learn about, um, basically our field and make sure that we're staying on top of the research. But even though this approach goes back 100 years, the the new research that we have now with all of the new technology we have now is actually still really supporting what Orton and Gillingham had understand based on the research they were able to do and what they had come up with even 100 years ago. So let me tell you about the principles. This is really sort of at the core of what makes Orton-Gillingham instruction unique, I guess. I already mentioned that it's diagnostic and prescriptive. So, which if you think about Dr. Orton being a physician, he would look at things in terms of diagnostically, you're really studying the individual. So in his case, it would have been the patient. For us, it's our student. We're continuously monitoring the verbal, the nonverbal, the written responses of the individual we're working with. So we can identify and analyze where are their sticking points and also where are they making progress. And we plan our next lesson based on what happened in this lesson. So we can't, plan out for an entire year of lessons, or we can't even plan like weeks ahead. We're planning really sort of as we go based on exactly what happened in one lesson. So the diagnostic part is all of the observation. The prescriptive part is we're figuring out what does this student need? Where do they need extra help? What kind of multisensory activity do they need to help them get past the places where they're sort of stuck? And we're always, making sure we follow up on errors, for example, because that shows us where our students are just, a little bit confused. So I have this Anna Gillingham quote, go as fast as you can, but as slow as you must. And in our diagnostic and prescriptive work, because we're always responding to how our students are doing in real time, we want students to make as much progress as possible, as quickly as possible, but we know that in order for the information to really be secure, we really want to teach to mastery and to automaticity. So we can't push them any faster than they're able to go. And that's part of the diagnostic and prescriptive teaching, is that our pacing can really be tailored to their needs. Orton-Gillingham is individualized. So, even someone with a diagnosis of dyslexia, there such a wide, range of learning profiles. So, there are going to be some similarities, and that's we can reach everyone through our Orton-Gillingham instruction, but we also tailor our lessons to the individuals in our group that we're working with, their learning profiles, their cultural backgrounds, their identity, their interests, because all of those things, impact their learning, their interest and excitement and attachment to what we're doing, and just sort of what is going to resonate with them. It's language-based and alphabetic phonetic. So first of all, our instruction is based on the structure and the history of the English language. Understanding some of the history of English can explain why, for example, we have so many different ways of spelling the same sound. So, if you ever watch the Scripps Spelling Bee and you know that the participants will sometimes ask for the language of origin of the word that they're spelling, because actually, if you really understand the structure and the history of English and all the different languages that have influenced English as different people have conquered other people and brought their language in, in some of our words over time, then that, for example, knowing that a word like chromosome, if you hear that sound, oh, that's a high level science word that probably comes from Greek, that probably has CH spelling that sound. Certainly we want the teachers who teach Orton-Gillingham to have that background and that understanding because that informs their teaching. But also, as it's appropriate over time, we teach those elements to our students too, because that helps them to understand why English is the way that it is, rather than it being about just rote memorization of like how to spell certain words or how to recognize certain words. We integrate oral language, reading, spelling, and writing. It's really a holistic way of working on the language. It's not just about reading. I think a lot of times we talk about teaching reading and we really do tend to focus just on reading, but in Orton-Gillingham, we're really working holistically on all aspects of the language. And our instruction, I just mentioned the Gillingham manual sort of broke our really complex language down from simple to complex because that's really how we need to teach people. So we teach in a way that starts with just the basics, the individual phonemes, the individual sounds of our speech, and teaching like the letter sound correspondences. We follow the alphabetic principle. So, English is a code. It's letter, sound, correspondence, code. Again, it's not about just memorizing words. And we also, at higher levels, we get up into more complex word structures with multisyllabic words, with prefixes and Latin roots and suffixes, and also more and more complex text structures as students are ready to work, at those sort of higher levels. It's multisensory. And not only is it multisensory, but actually simultaneous multisensory. So we have students using multiple sensory inputs and pathways throughout the lesson simultaneously. So there's a lot of verbalizing while you're writing or touching while you're reading, and a lot of manipulative. So here I mentioned visual, auditory, and kinesthetic being our three kind of like main sensory pathways that we employ all through an Orton-Gillingham lesson. There was actually a really wonderful presentation that I got to attend as an Orton-Gillingham Fellow this last spring at the Orton-Gillingham Academy Conference. And it was actually a presentation on, research that supports the efficacy of all of these Orton-Gillingham principles. And so one of the bits of information that was referenced to support the impact and the power of multisensory instruction, not just in an Orton-Gillingham lesson, but just in general, is this bit here that I'll read you. So when there are multiple pathways, which is also referred to as cross-brain referencing. So basically like multiple areas of the brain being engaged, connecting learning, retrieval can occur from a variety of cues and memories are more permanent. So when you have information coming into your brain through multiple pathways, as you're learning about something and you have these multiple areas of your brain that connect to these different senses all engaged, it gives you more ways to retrieve that information. And so you're able to store that information in your memory more efficiently. So that's one of the big things I think that people know about and think about when they think of Orton-Gillingham. Orton-Gillingham is direct and explicit instruction. So we teach exactly, clearly, and explicitly the information that we want our students to know. We state it clearly, we model it, we have them practice with support. We have them then eventually do it independently. So I came from an inquiry-based science teaching background before I started doing OG, and I was a little skeptical of the idea of like direct and explicit because it didn't seem child-centered and exploratory. But I mean, obviously here I am so many years later, I got hooked because it's so effective. And because, there are some students who can sit in a classroom and sort of absorb, or they can just sit down with a book and they can kind of intuit, information about reading. But the majority of students, not even just students with dyslexia, but just the majority of students in general, they're not going to learn how to read unless the information is really made explicit and very clear for them and is repeated, and they are given a lot of practice with it. And certainly individuals with dyslexia need that to an even greater extent. So, but I have this picture. Whenever I do this slide, I always say that, you can absolutely still have fun, play games, in a lesson, and have it still be sort of working towards our, Orton-Gillingham goals. So this is a picture of a shell phone, because this is to represent one OG teacher who my mentor Lori had supervised, who every day when it was time in her classroom to do their Orton-Gillingham lesson, she would have her shell phone ring and she would go and she would pick it up and she would hear what that day's like reading lesson was going to be in the shell phone. So, I mean, just like we individualize our lessons for our students, teachers individualize their lessons based on their personality, and they can bring, like fun routines and rituals to it. But really, I mean, students are engaged by it also because they learn from it and they actually learn how to read. So, that's very motivating for them. But we teach with direct and explicit instruction. It's structured, sequential, and cumulative, but flexible. So again, we go from simple to complex. We don't always follow the same structure or sequence depending on who our student is, because different students need different things. But we kind of cover all of these levels. Like I said, we teach individual sound symbol correspondences. We teach spelling rules. We teach syllable patterns. We teach spelling generalizations. We teach grammar and larger linguistic principles. So we're really, working on all of these different levels very holistically. And we're always, when we introduce something new, we start by referencing something that they already know and then making a connection to the new information so that they kind of know where to place this new information in their existing knowledge. And then we give them time, we give them a lot of practice with it. We don't just instantly move on to the next thing. And actually, if you look at an OG lesson, which we will in a little bit, you see that we spend a huge amount of time on review because we know our students need that in order to keep growing their body of knowledge instead of just sort of knowing what we're currently working on, which I think happens in a lot of traditional classrooms when there's new information being introduced all the time. Students kind of can grasp what's currently going on, but they've completely forgotten something they learned months ago. And in our lessons, we're always making sure that we're just growing that body of knowledge instead of just sort of pulling students along through, a huge array of skills and not really giving them time to fully grasp them. Our work is synthetic and analytic. So synthetic meaning like blending, going from part to whole. Like when we read, we are blending the sounds together. We're going from the individual letters and sounds to the whole word. But we're also synthetic. So when we spell, we take the whole word, we break it apart, we analyze the sounds. So again, we don't just care about reading. We don't just care about how well a student can read a passage. We care about spelling. We care about writing skills. Spelling really influences writing skills. We care about oral language. So we care about both the synthetic, the blending together, like what we do in reading, and the analytic, the breaking apart, like we do when we spell. And then this last principle of OG is really important. Orton-Gillingham is emotionally sound. So the kind of instruction that we do really builds the students' confidence. It builds their trust in us as their teacher, but also sometimes just in school. Again, if they felt really, uncomfortable and anxious about all the things that they were asked to do in a traditional classroom that maybe were not things that they were able to attain. In our classes, we only
Back
ask
in the
them to do.
day,
Oh,
but they're looking like, oh, it's like midnight. Oh,
um, yeah, we only ask students to do things that we've taught them to do.
oh yeah.
That's kind of follows our principles of OG. So, and because we give them things that they're able to be successful with. And so that also is part of the emotionally sound sort of aspect of Orton-Gillingham. And so if we're following all of those other teaching principles, then the emotionally sound part just sort of naturally comes with it. So in an Orton-Gillingham lesson, if you look at an OG lesson, it's packed. We really, even though some things we just spend a few minutes sort of hitting on, we really are very comprehensive in a lesson. So we work on handwriting if the student needs it. If they're already past that, we don't need to do that anymore. We do quick drills, like phonics drills, where students are really quickly just solidifying their letter sound associations. We do a spelling version of that we call the auditory drill, where we dictate sounds and students are quickly pulling up, mentally and writing down the spellings that associate with the sound, because those drills keep our students sort of primed on their letter sound knowledge and ready for reading and spelling later in the lesson. We do phonological awareness, which phonological awareness is basically sort of awareness of an ability to manipulate the individual sounds in speech, which is actually, it doesn't sound like it has anything to do with reading because it doesn't have to do with letters, but it's actually like the foundation of our reading, because when we read, we need to tie letters to those speech sounds. So we work on that. We have a quick part of our lesson where we're working specifically on phonological awareness. We work a little bit on non-phonetic words, words that you can't sound out for reading and spelling, even though that's not the majority of our focus. Students need to know those words too. So we got that in there. We have students reading and spelling in single words that use all of the different skills and elements that we've taught them, because we're always kind of cumulatively reviewing and building their knowledge. We're going from part to whole. So then we have students reading and spelling sentences. If they're ready, I have a little asterisk next to new information, because we're not always going to introduce something new in our lessons, because as I said, they're not always ready for it. They need time to really deeply learn what we've just taught them and kind of assimilate it with what they already know. But of course, when they're ready, we teach them something new. We have them do oral reading because we want them to work on their reading fluency and their comprehension, and we work on written expression. So we go from like the most sort of minute pieces of literacy all the way up to more and more complex pieces, and we fit it all in there. Pacing is important in our lesson. Okay, so in terms of why Orton-Gillingham is effective for individuals with dyslexia, I just want to tell you a little bit about what we know about what happens in the brain as we learn how to read, which is fascinating. And so on the left here, we have a representation of the left hemisphere, so basically like the left half of a kind of typical reader's brain at the age of 7. When someone in that age is reading, this section here that says LS, that's the letter sound part of the brain. So that's the part of the brain that sort of can see the letters and then know what sound it makes. That part of your brain engages a lot when you're a young early reader. And then here it says SS, meaning speech sound, which means like the part of your brain that's actually part of our speech system that lets you say things and talk. So when young readers are reading, they're really using the part of their brain that attaches the sounds to the letters, and actually then they're articulating those sounds. So that's why like young kids aren't really good at silent reading. They kind of need to say it all as they're reading. Typically, after enough years of that, the activation in the brain actually starts to shift. So around the age of 10, if we look at how the brain is usually activating when someone's reading, there's actually not that much activation of that letter sound and the speech sound area anymore. And there's this new area, visual word form area. And it's this area that's like right at the kind of meeting of our visual and our language systems. Because when we're reading, we're using our visual and our language systems. And that area of the brain is really good at basically after you've sounded out words enough times, starting to just recognize those words automatically. So this is what would typically happen, sort of the typical development and trajectory of readers if they know those letter sounds and they're able to sound out words over time. And then once you start using this visual word form area, instead of having to sound out any word or every single word, you become a lot more fluent and automatic as a reader. However, for individual, oh, I'm sorry. And let me tell you one more thing about that. So there's this process called orthographic mapping, and that's basically what I was just describing. So it involves the formation of letter sound connections to bond the spellings to the pronunciations and meanings of specific words in memory. So basically, knowing the letter sound connections and sounding them out enough times lets you kind of form this like this very strong association between the meaning, the sound, and the spelling of the word. And then you start to be able to just recognize that word instantly and spell it from memory and know the vocabulary. So this is a really important process in our, becoming fluent readers. So for individuals with dyslexia, there are a couple of differences from what we would see in a typical reader. So in a reader with dyslexia, rather than that visual word form area coming online around the age of 10 and really helping us become a lot more fast and fluent, readers with dyslexia tend to keep really relying on that speech sound part of the brain and needing to sound everything out and articulate it, sometimes because they don't know the letter sound connections well enough to read the words enough times to then get them stored in their letter sound, the visual word form area of the word. So in the brain of a reader with dyslexia, we tend to see too much or more reliance than you would expect at their age on that speech sound system that's usually just used by younger readers. And another thing is, instead of having a lot of that brain activity when reading concentrated in the left hemisphere, we actually see it sort of scattered between the left and the right. And so it's not really organized in the way that it would be in a typical reader. So what's one thing I find very exciting, because we have technology that we obviously didn't have in Orton and Gillingham's day, we can do brain imaging and we can see what is actually going on, what parts of the brain are activating when people are reading, people of all ages. But so this is these are some images from a study where a young person in kindergarten who was considered an at-risk reader. So there would have been some early indicators that this young person might potentially, have a reading disability. There's some brain imaging that shows how this young student's brain was activating in kindergarten before having any sort of reading intervention. So on the left hemisphere, we can see there wasn't a lot of activation when this young child was doing reading related tasks. But actually we see a lot of activation in the right hemisphere, which is not the hemisphere that we expect to see activate during reading. After having a structured literacy intervention, along the lines of Orton-Gillingham, the next year in first grade, the same child had brain imaging done, and you see totally different activation that looks much more like what we would see in a typical reader. For a first grader, we really want to see these two areas in the left hemisphere, that letter sound and the speech sound area, activating, because this child now knows how to sound out all of these words. And so as a result, that visual word form area, this yellow part closer to the back of the brain, it's growing and developing, and that's great. That's what we want to see. And so we see less activation on the right-hand side. So I love showing this to teachers. Sometimes I've even shown it to students to show that we really are able to rewire, people's brains, which might sound creepy, but it's through those teaching principles that I was just talking about in the multisensory instruction. It really does help to create those sort of more efficient pathways for reading that are what we would see in a typical reader. And so I find this, this kind of research very exciting. So I did just want to mention, because sometimes parents will ask, well, how long will my child need OG instruction? How long will it take to do that brain rewiring? And everyone is different. So, dyslexia is sort of on a continuum. And like I said, people have different learning profiles. So there are a lot of factors that can impact exactly how long someone will need dyslexia. I'm sorry, someone will need Orton-Gillingham. And it's another factor in that is the frequency and the consistency of the instruction. But typically it's a multiple year process of, there's a lot to learn in the structure of the English language, and it's a complex language. So, and our students need explicit instruction. They need a lot of repetition. So, it's not something that happens quickly, but it's a really lasting change that we make over those years. So again, we go as fast as we can, but as slow as we must. And, we can't sacrifice accuracy for speed, I guess. So, yeah. So, but again, it does vary for each individual. And I just wanted to, cite a little bit of research about that process of reading a word and having it eventually, after it's been read a few times, become something that can be recognized and read accurately and automatically. So for a typical reader, the number of exposures and reading that word would be between 4 and 14 repetitions, and then it could be recognized pretty reliably and accurately. For someone with reading difficulties, so, for someone with dyslexia, it takes more than 40 repetitions with that word. So that's, just, I guess, going back to the idea again of the importance of our direct and explicit instruction, making things really clear to our students, but also the repetition that we do with our students. It just takes them more time to learn the information really solidly. And so we just need to give them that time. Another reason, that Orton-Gillingham is effective, I don't know how much people who are sort of outside of the education world really follow things like the reporting that there's been a lot of reporting in the last few years on Lucy Calkins and the Columbia Teachers College reading program, and some other very popular reading programs that are starting to kind of fall out of favor and be replaced by programs that are really considered aligned with the science of reading. But a big difference between those programs and then something like our Orton-Gillingham approach, or a program based on Orton-Gillingham, is what strategies are taught to students for what to do when you encounter a word that you don't know how to read. I mean, Orton-Gillingham, it's really based on explicit phonics. So we teach students how to sound those words out. They read them enough times, eventually they don't need to sound them out anymore. Whereas the programs like the Lucy Calkins program are based more on giving strategies to students to guess words that they don't know, or to use context to help them, or to predict what the word says, and not really about how to analyze the word itself. And so, what I just said about how you develop into a fluent reader, once you become a fluent reader, you read so quickly that it does look like you've just memorized these words, or maybe that you're predicting them, as you go. And so these teaching approaches for reading that try to sort of emulate what fluent readers and automatic readers do by just trying to have kids memorize and guess, they don't understand the importance of, it takes years of doing this, sounding it out, and that orthographic mapping process that I just mentioned, to get to the point where you recognize the words accurately and automatically, and you can read fluently. And so in a program that tries to skip over all of that really important phonics knowledge that's necessary in those first few years of reading, it just doesn't I mean, it works for certain kids. Like I said, there's a small number of kids who you can teach them like a book in a cave and they'll just figure it out. But for the majority of kids, they really need that explicit phonics instruction over years. And that's how they get to that point of being fluent readers. So Orton-Gillingham, if you say to an Orton-Gillingham fellow, if you call it a method or a program or a system or a technique, you will probably be corrected, because, we're kind of emphatic about the fact that what we do is an instructional approach, and it's what makes it Orton-Gillingham is basically that we employ all of those principles that I described, and we have all of those components of the lesson. But what makes it different from a program, for example, is the fact that we don't have, some programs have scripted lessons. We certainly don't. As I said, we're always writing our lesson in response to exactly what happened in the previous lesson. So I just have a few examples of some popular OG-based programs, which I mean are wonderful as classroom programs, but I do just want to explain what the difference between a program, even a program based on Orton-Gillingham, is versus sort of the Orton-Gillingham approach and sort of traditional Orton-Gillingham. So again, unlike a program, our scope and sequence, so the actual progression of skills that we teach, how quickly we move through our sequence, specifically what things we're doing in our lesson, in what order, we have a lot of flexibility as a teaching approach. And so we don't have to follow the same scope and sequence all the time if we don't think that's what's best for the student that we're working with that we're working with. And, I have all of these different components of the lesson that I'm always teaching, which, I just showed earlier, but sometimes I teach them in a different order depending on who my student is. And, you really don't have that flexibility when you're working in a program, because the expectation in the program is that you are moving step by step through the program. And again, sometimes you're following the exact script of the program. You're using just the materials provided from the program. So Orton-Gillingham, it's very flexible. You can also incorporate materials and resources from other programs. And I think it's great to do that, as long as you know that they're quality materials and that they're appropriate for your student. So it's very flexible. It can be sort of integrated with other things, other resources. But The trade-off with that is that it requires rigorous teacher training because you really need to know what you're doing if you're not just following exactly what the manual is telling you and you're really tailoring everything to the needs of your students. So I want to tell you a little bit about what that teacher training entails. And actually, before that, even just mentioned, there's a lot of confusion about what it means to be trained in Orton-Gillingham. And so even when I talk to people and they'll say, oh, you're an OG fellow, I'm trained in OG. And then if we talk about it a little more, it can mean so many different things. And so sometimes people will mean like I went to a workshop, which could have been like a 1-day workshop or a few hours, or maybe it was a few days on the topic of OG. Or sometimes they mean that they're trained in a program based on OG, like they use foundations or they use PAF. Or maybe it actually means that they worked with an OG fellow and they went through the training, but they did just the coursework part of the training. What the Orton-Gillingham Academy would like people to mean when they say they're trained in Orton-Gillingham is that they've completed the coursework, they've completed the practicum, they got certification at the level of their training. And so, they're really fully trained in Orton-Gillingham. So, I mean, there's no police that comes around and interrogates what people mean when they say, I'm trained in OG, but it's something, it can be confusing for parents too, to talk to different people who say that they're OG trained. And really, it can just mean a lot of different things. So there are a lot of different organizations and companies that do Orton-Gillingham training, and I just kind of pulled a couple, like IMSE, this Institute for Multisensory Education, as one that's pretty well known. There's also an Orton-Gillingham online academy, and there are just a lot of different companies and organizations. I personally, I'm a fellow of the Orton-Gillingham Academy, which we used to be called the Academy of Orton-Gillingham Practitioners and Educators, which is a little cumbersome. So this was our old acronym, AOGPE, but now we're just OGA. It's just a little bit confusing because there's stuff like Orton-Gillingham Online Academy that sounds similar, but the Orton-Gillingham Academy, we were founded in 1995. I mean, obviously I'm biased, but often referred to, including by like really respected researchers in the field, as the gold standard for OG training, partly because we have very rigorous training standards. Also because any fellow of the Orton-Gillingham Academy can trace their training lineage directly back to Orton or Gillingham. And actually, in my training lineage, I go back to both because I had two different fellows who trained me at different levels of my training who go back to either Orton or Gillingham. So we really have a very direct connection to the creators of this approach. So the classroom educator level training is what Lori Cousseau and I are doing with the Churchill teachers. And so this entails 30 hours of coursework on a variety of topics, all related to teaching reading, but also the background knowledge that you need to really be a skilled teacher of literacy. So we talk about how reading is acquired in all learners, and then how the needs of individuals with dyslexia are somewhat unique. We talk about the brain research on the topic of reading. We look at theoretical models that sort of represent our different understandings of the reading process. Phonological and phonemic awareness, that sound layer of the language. Phonics, which is, at the heart of what we do. Fluency, reading fluency, vocabulary, reading comprehension, written expression, making sure that teachers understand the structure and the history of the English language. Obviously, they need to understand those principles of Orton-Gillingham instruction, and then how to plan and implement a lesson. So just like we pack a lot into our lessons with our students, OG fellows pack a lot into their trainings too, because our teachers really need to be very knowledgeable. And so in addition to the coursework, there's also a 50-hour practicum, which actually I say 50-hour minimum because many of the teachers we're working with are going to far exceed that number just with how the intensity of the instruction that they're doing and how frequently they're teaching. Teachers need to be teaching OG lessons multiple times per week over the course of an entire school year. They're observed 5 times with written and oral feedback by fellows of the academy. I'm just finding in our work with the Churchill school teachers that they're so thoughtful about how to implement this, again, flexible approach to make it really work with the structure that's already, existing in the school and their specific population. And there's so much communication and coordination between the different grade levels and the subject areas, training teachers who are teaching all these different subject areas, not just the ones who really focus on language arts, is very gratifying and, and very wise of them to do. So it's a thorough training, and it's, and the practicum where they're actually doing the teaching and getting the feedback is such an important part of it. So just to sort of wrap up, we we know that Orton-Gillingham is really supportive to reading and is really effective. Also, because there are two really strong predictors of reading achievement, like even really young students can be screened to see, these are two areas where if students struggle in these areas, they can be flagged as at risk for, possibly having dyslexia. So one is phonological awareness, which I've already mentioned. It's the ability to hear and manipulate sounds in speech. And we obviously, we work on that a lot in our lessons. We have a small section dedicated exactly to that. But even when we teach students to sound out words and blend them when they read, or to tap the sounds that they hear in words for spelling, that's phonological awareness that we're working on and building up for them. Rapid automatized naming, the ability to quickly name aloud a series of familiar items, like to quickly say the colors that you see or the shapes that you see or the letters that you see. Individuals with dyslexia tend to struggle with either the phonological awareness, the speech sound piece, or the rapid automatized naming. So basically being able to connect your visual system to your language system very quickly and automatically, or sometimes both. And so in our lessons, again, we're working a lot on phonological awareness throughout the lesson, but that rapid automatized naming, we do so much repetition. We use all of those sensory pathways, and we really teach to automaticity so that even for a student who has weakness in that area, they're able to retrieve the information automatically after so much practice with us. And so that really frees up their sort of cognitive space for doing those higher level things like reading comprehension and written expression. So one last thing that I wanted to mention is, I referenced earlier that I was able to attend a really wonderful presentation on how, research that supports the Orton-Gillingham teaching principles. And so some of the some of the data that I was presented came from John Hattie's books, Visible Learning for Literacy, and Visible Learning, the sequel, who is an Australian educational researcher and is really focused on making sure that our teaching practices are based on research and into what is actually effective and not just like feelings or anecdotes. And so, he's done these humongous meta-analyses of studies that cover, over 130,000 studies, millions and millions of students. And so all of the Orton-Gillingham principles he found to have really impressive effect sizes in terms of, really they're demonstrably effective and make an impact. So, so I just wanted to throw that in there. And yeah, and then this is me and this is my information. But yeah, so I see that some things popped up in the chat, but I haven't actually looked at it yet. But if anyone has questions, let me.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, you can definitely raise your hand if you have some questions. And then Katie, yeah, there are the questions in the chat if you want to feel free to answer those. If you read them out loud.
Sure. Okay. So the first one I see is, can you please share the scope and sequence to be an avid reader, and how does OG help improve vocabulary and reading comprehension? The scope and sequence, we have a scope and sequence that, Lori and I shared sort of our typical scope and sequence, and then, sort of working with the teachers at Churchill. Now there's like because again, it's something that can be individualized. So there's a scope and sequence that everyone, within Churchill is going to be referencing. It covers an insanely huge amount of things because it covers from first grade to ninth grade instruction. So I can't kind of rattle everything off, but it goes from like the phonics level, like starting with basic letter sounds, going all the way up into morphology, like studying, like Latin roots and prefixes and suffixes. So yeah, so that's just kind of my quick summary of the scope and sequence that the teachers in here will be working from. And then in terms of Orton-Gillingham improving vocabulary and reading comprehension, I did mention just the idea of teaching morphemes. So for example, like teaching that the prefix re means back or again. So anytime I hear a word that has re at the beginning, that tells me something about the meaning of the word. We study words systematically. So morphology is really helpful with vocabulary, but also, I mean, partly just if you can read the word, that's the first step to then learning it as a vocabulary word. But we do, I mean, we talk about the meaning of words in our lessons, and we talk about how, I mean, we use them in different contexts and with the same, you know, repetition that I talked about, even with reading and spelling practice. In terms of reading comprehension, I mean, a lot of reading comprehension difficulties come from decoding problems. So first of all, just teaching students to actually be able to read the words off the page helps enormously with reading comprehension. But in addition, you know, we teach specific reading comprehension strategies, and working on written expression, helping students become better writers, actually really helps their reading comprehension, because if they can write well and they can write lots of different types of sentences, then they actually are able to comprehend those different sentence structures when they read them. So there are kind of a lot of different ways that we incorporate vocabulary and reading comprehension, and they become a bigger and bigger part of our lessons as you know, as students progress in their skills. However, in the structure of the Churchill School, even students who are working at just such a basic level of phonics in their early years, they're still getting a really nice big chunk of time, you know, regularly to work on those higher level skills, the reading comprehension and the written expression. So it's not like we wait on teaching those until students have higher level decoding skills. Okay, I see another question. My daughter can struggle with organizing her ideas for writing projects. You mentioned earlier that with middle school or older students, your tutoring work can include things like essay writing. How would you use OGE training in that area? So, you know, basically, I mean, there are some individuals with OG training who have taken the principles that I just outlined for how we teach, you know, reading and spelling, and actually applied those to how you teach written expression. So taking like the big task of writing an essay and breaking it down into really small kind of systematic steps that are a lot more manageable, and teaching kids that process. Also teaching kids how, you know, really explicitly teaching, like, this is a simple sentence, this is a compound sentence, this is a complex sentence, and practicing writing and, you know, all of those different sentence structures. Those are kind of you know, breaking down the writing process into manageable steps that students gradually learn to kind of walk themselves through, and giving them a toolbox of lots of different sentence structures that they can pull into their writing. Those are kind of like the two basic areas, or, you know, main ways that I incorporate OG into writing support. Oh, and that, you know, the teachers working with your children at Churchill do too. Okay, I see a question. Can you, oh, and the thank yous. Thank you. That's, you're welcome. Can you also share how OG teaching applies specifically to those kids with language-based learning disabilities, mixed processing, as we focus a lot on dyslexia, for example, but what about kids with more comprehension? So yeah, I mean, there are some students who don't necessarily have as difficult a time with actually reading the words off the page, and it is more a difficulty with language comprehension. And so, I mean, one thing that is really wonderful is that the speech and language pathologists in the school have participated in Orton-Gillingham training, and, you know, they are the ones who really do the most sort of intensive work on, you know, like oral language, but there's so much overlap between their work and our work as Orton-Gillingham practitioners. But the same, you know, the same way that we break sort of big complex things up into small, manageable, kind of simple to complex skills that we teach and we practice with students, you can do the same thing with comprehension, and, you know, really teach strategies in a very systematic way to really help students, you know, gain a bigger repertoire of skills for working on reading comprehension. And the way that we pull vocabulary into our lessons also really helps with comprehension, because more vocabulary knowledge is going to help you understand more texts. And I also mentioned how the written expression work that we do with students supports comprehension. So, you know, OG is definitely, I mean, we do think more of like sort of classic students with dyslexia when we talk about Orton-Gillingham, but really it is useful for kids who struggle with reading for a variety of reasons. Okay, can you please share the scope and sequence? That would be helpful for parents to support kids at home. And I guess, Lynn, I could talk to you about, you know, answering that question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's specifically a Churchill parent, if it's a Churchill parent, we can absolutely, you'll get that information from your child's teacher. Otherwise, I would say for OG, I mean, in terms of a specific sequence, you could kind of refer to lots of different places for a proper sequence, right? Like, so a program like Wilson or PF, they all have their own sequences that are fine, right?
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and even as Orton-Gillingham Fellows, we have different sequences depending on how we were trained and sort of how we've adapted things based on our practice and our experience over the years. So there are a lot of sequences out there. But yeah, I mean, like Lynn said, in terms of something that's accessible just to anyone, programs that are based on Orton-Gillingham usually have good sequences, so.
I will say for just so Churchill families know too, like Kathy Pepper's here, if you see her at Meet the Faculty Night or anything, just say thank you. She did this incredible job of taking some of Katie and Lori's work and then creating this whole, from that, adapting an entire sequence for all of our teachers, lower school to upper school, that incorporates morphology, a lot of morphology for the upper school students. But I mean, Katie and Lori, I can't say enough about. It was I sat through both of their trainings and I felt like I learned something new each time. And it was just phenomenal. It's so much information to acquire. And then they gave us the tools, and then Kathy kind of mapped everything out for all the teachers, which has been really incredible.
Thanks. Yeah, I was really impressed with what Kathy did. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of it being individualized. What she did was sort of take what we shared, which was more general, and then really make it specific for the population here. And I mean, and there's already talk and sort of recognition of the fact that it's a work in progress. And, this year implementing it, there will probably be things that people will be like, oh, let's change this for next year. And that's great. And that's the way it should be. Um, I think there are just a couple more. Let's see. Someone asked, you talked about how the brain transitions from age 7 to age 10, where there is more reliance on visual word form association. How does an older child acquire the skills if their brain pathways are more formed, aka more permanent? Actually, there's research to show that these brain changes can take place at any age. So it's not, of course, it's great. We talk a lot about early intervention, early identification, early screening. Like we want everyone to have this kind of instruction early on. But even if you don't get it sort of in that early window period, your brain can still change. So I know, brain plasticity is amazing, and we actually have a lot more of it throughout our lives than I think a lot of us think. Okay, how does OG instruction look different for middle school students as compared to elementary age learners? That I mean, there tends to be just like what, regular English language arts instruction, it looks different between elementary and middle school because there's sort of more sophisticated text being analyzed and discussed, more writing demands being placed on older learners. That's reflected in our OG instruction. For some middle schoolers, if they've already gotten really solid phonics instruction, then there might be more emphasis on morphology and that kind of like higher level word structure in addition to that more sophisticated reading comprehension and written expression. But sometimes you have middle school students who they don't have the decoding skills, and so they need that same phonics work that maybe some of the younger students in elementary school have because the middle schoolers just didn't get it in elementary school. And so if that's what they need, we do it even in the middle school. But it can be done usually sort of at a little bit of a faster pace because just sort of like cognitively they can handle it at a faster pace. So yeah. Yeah, so
I would just add also, like at Churchill, because so many of our students in the upper school, they're dyslexic, so they're still struggling. So I'm doing the practicum, and I'll be working with some students in the upper grades. And I was telling Katie before I started some of my assessments, and I know there's stuff we're gonna have to go over they've had before, and so it's sort of, you have to get a little creative. Like we'll try to work in use morphology, like teaching some prefixes and suffixes and roots with using some of those vowel sounds you want to target. So you kind of get a twofer where you're able to address all those things. And you can of course do that with lower school students too, but a lot of that is so much about the exposure at that point and the remediation, whereas they get older, it's also like the motivation. It has a lot to do, honestly, with the motivation and the learned helplessness that you kind of have to work your way through.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I mean, a lot of kids really don't get that morphology work unless they're getting like SAT tutoring, when they're about to go into their senior year of high school. So it's amazing, especially for the older students, to get that work. But if they have gaps in their phonics skills, then that is, older students like middle and high school students, a lot of times there is sort of going back and forth between the morphology skills and then filling gaps that might be in more basic skills. Whereas for the elementary age learners, it tends to be more, still focused on phonology, even going up to some more sophisticated, parts of phonics instruction. But yeah, that's a great point, Lynn.
Thank you. I know it's a little after 1, so if there's any last questions, this is a great time to ask them. And you can always, I can stay on if anybody has any questions about how Churchill's implementing OG this year. But again, I just want to say thank you so much to Katie, who not only first helped us get a grant for this when I emailed her like 1.5 years ago and with a sudden deadline, and she was amazing and helped us, and then helped us get Lori too when we had the opportunity, thanks to so many families on this call, to do a lot this summer. And she's just been so amazing to work with, so knowledgeable, and we're just really grateful for all your work with us, Katie.
Thanks. I'm so excited to be part of this. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll stay on for a couple of minutes in case anybody has any questions, but I do want to again also to say thank you to Jennifer Hamilton for the idea for this. I'm always looking for parental input on sessions. So if you have any thoughts for me on other things you'd like to hear about this year, please don't be shy. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Thanks. Thanks so much, Katie.
Thanks.
Talk soon.
Bye.
Bye.